The air in the small third-floor apartment was thick with the smell of old wood and dust, mixed with the faint, greasy scent of takeout noodles from the night before. But for Leo, none of that mattered. All that existed was the space between his fingers and the worn, yellowed ivory of the piano keys. His old upright piano, which he had affectionately named the Beast, took up most of the living room, its dark, scarred wood, a permanent fixture against the peeling wallpaper. It wasn't a beautiful instrument. One of its legs was propped up on a stack of old textbooks to stop it from wobbling, and a long, jagged scratch ran down its side. A battle scar from its previous, unknown life. But when Leo played, the Beast sang with a voice that was uniquely its own, a voice that was rough around the edges. A little out of tune, but full of soul. Leo's day had been the same as the one before. And the one before that? He spent his hours under the harsh fluorescent lights of a massive warehouse, stacking heavy boxes onto a high shelf. The work was mind-numbing, a rhythmic dance of lift-turn, in place that left his back aching and his hands covered in a fine layer of cardboard dust. His coworkers were a blur of tired faces and grumbled complaints. They saw him as the quiet kid, the one who kept his head down and did his job without a fuss. They didn't know that when the warehouse whistle blew, signaling the end of the day, a different Leo emerged. They didn't know about the fire that burned inside him, a fire that only the Beast could understand. He had found the piano a year ago in the corner of a dusty thrift store, a forgotten giant with a for sale $50 or best offer sign hanging from a key. It had been love at first sight. He spent his entire savings that week, not just on the piano itself, but on sandpaper, wood glue, and cans of black lacquer. For months, his evenings were dedicated to bringing it back to life. He sanded down the scratches, tightened the loose wires, and gently coaxed the sticky keys back into motion. It was a labor of love, a way of pouring his own hopes and dreams into something tangible. Now, the Beast was more than just a piano. It was his closest friend, the one thing in his life that was truly his. He didn't play from sheet music. He couldn't afford it, and besides, the music he wanted to play didn't exist on paper. His songs were born from the city itself. As his fingers danced across the keys, a low, rumbling bass line would emerge, mimicking the sound of the subway train that rumbled beneath his building every few minutes. A sudden, high-pitched flurry of notes would sound like the wail of a distant S-inning siren, a cry of urgency that echoed through the concrete canyons outside his window. His music had the rhythm of footsteps on a rainy pavement, the gentle hum of streetlights at dusk, and the quiet, lonely whistle of the wind as it found its way through a crack in his window frame. Tonight the music was particularly sad. A slow, melancholic melody filled the room, each note hanging in the air like a heavy raindrop. It was the sound of his own loneliness, the feeling of being a tiny, invisible part of a giant, uncaring city. He thought about his coworkers, who would go home to families and loud dinners. He thought about the people he saw on the street, laughing together, walking hand in hand, their lives seeming so full and connected. And then there was him, in his small, quiet apartment, with only a beat-up piano for company. He poured all of that feeling into the Beast, and the piano seemed to understand, groaning and sighing along with him. But as the song reached its end, something shifted. The sadness began to melt away, replaced by a flicker of something else. A new melody began to form, this one faster, more hopeful. It started small, like a single seed pushing through a crack in the sidewalk. The notes were lighter, more playful, dancing up and down the scales. It was the sound of a dream, a secret wish he barely dared to admit to himself. He imagined what it would be like to play on a real stage, in a grand hall filled with people who had come just to listen. He pictured a gleaming, perfect piano, one that didn't wobble and had all its keys. In his mind, he saw the faces in the crowd, their eyes closed, lost in the music he was creating. He often spent his nights like this. After a long day at the warehouse, scrolling through videos on his cracked phone, he watched famous pianists, their fingers flying across the keys with an effortless grace that both inspired and intimidated him. He saw the ornate concert halls, the velvet curtains, the sparkling chandeliers. It was a world so far removed from his own that it felt like a different planet. But watching them didn't make him feel hopeless. It made him feel determined. It was a reminder of what was possible, a beacon of light in the dim reality of his life. His music grew louder, more confident now. The hopeful melody swelled, filling every corner of the small apartment. It was no longer just a collection of sounds. It was a statement. It was a declaration that his world, as small and cramped as it was, had its own kind of beauty. It was a promise to himself that one day other people would hear it too. He wasn't just playing the piano anymore. He was telling his own story, the story of a boy from the wrong side of town who had a fire in his soul and a song in his heart. The final notes of the piece rang out, clear and strong, and for a moment, the city outside seemed to fall silent, as if it were listening. Leo leaned back, his chest heaving, a small smile on his face. He didn't know how, and he didn't know when, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was just the beginning. The beast, and the boy who brought it back to life, had a song to sing, and the whole world was going to hear it. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, right in the middle of a long, boring shift at the warehouse. It was a temp agency, offering a one-night job serving at a big party. The pay was more than Leo made in 3 days of stacking boxes. He said yes, without a second thought. He didn't know who the party was for, and he didn't care. It was money, and a chance to see a different part of the city, a part he only ever saw in movies or on the glossy pages of magazines left on the bus. On the night of the party, Leo put on his black and white uniform. The pants were a little too short, and the jacket felt stiff and unnatural on his shoulders. He took the bus out of his neighborhood, watching the familiar streets of corner stores and laundromats give way to wide tree-lined avenues. The houses got bigger and farther apart, each one hidden behind tall iron gates and perfectly manicured lawns. He felt like he was traveling to another country. The bus dropped him off at the edge of the wealthiest district, and he had to walk the last half-mile, the clip-clop of his cheap dress shoes echoing on the pristine sidewalk. The mansion was even bigger than he had imagined. It wasn't a house. It was a palace, with white columns, glowing windows, and a long, sweeping driveway filled with expensive cars. As he walked up the steps, his heart was pounding in his chest. He felt like an imposter, a kid from the wrong side of the tracks who was about to be found out. A stern-looking woman at the door pointed him towards the kitchen, where a dozen other servers in identical uniforms were rushing around, carrying trays of glasses and plates of fancy food. For the first hour, Leo was just a part of the background, a ghost in a black and white uniform. He carried trays of champagne, his eyes carefully fixed on the floor, trying to be as invisible as possible, but his eyes kept wandering. In the center of the grand ballroom, like a king on its throne, sat the most beautiful piano he had ever seen. It was a gleaming black Steinway grand, its polished surface reflecting the light from a giant crystal chandelier hanging above. It looked perfect, flawless. The keys were a bright, clean white, and they seemed to glow under the soft lights. Leo couldn't stop looking at it. He imagined what it would feel like to sit on that plush leather bench, to feel those perfect keys under his fingers. He wondered what kind of music a piano like that would sing. Would it be as full of soul as his old beast? Or would its sound be as perfect and cold as the room it was in? He was so lost in his thoughts that he didn't notice the young man watching him. This was Julian Sterling, the heir to the family that owned the mansion and everything in it. Julian was bored. The party was full of his parents' friends, people who talked about money and politics in loud, boring voices. He was looking for something, anything, to break the monotony. And then he saw the server, the kid in the ill-fitting uniform, staring at the piano with a look of such intense longing that it was almost painful to see. A slow, cruel smile spread across Julian's face. "Hey, you," Julian said, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. He gestured for Leo to come over. Leo froze, his heart leaping into his throat. He slowly walked towards the group of rich, beautifully dressed people, feeling their eyes on him. "You like that piano, don't you?" Julian asked, a smirk playing on his lips. Leo just nodded, not trusting his voice. "Of course you do," Julian said, turning to his friends. "I bet our little server here thinks he's a real musician." A few of Julian's friends chuckled. Leo felt his face get hot. He wanted to turn and run, but his feet were glued to the floor. "Come on then," Julian said, his voice loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "Give us a song. Entertain us." He pulled a crisp $100 bill from his wallet and held it out. "For your trouble," he added, as if he were doing Leo a great favor. A small crowd began to gather, their faces curious and amused. Leo felt trapped. He looked at the perfect, gleaming piano and then at the $100 bill, which felt less like a prize and more like an insult. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, waiting. He thought of his beast, of the rough, familiar keys that felt like an extension of his own hands. But this was something else entirely. Under the weight of their stares, and with a desperate need to prove them wrong, or maybe just to get it over with, he found himself nodding slowly. He walked towards the piano, his legs feeling like they were made of lead. He sat down on the cool leather bench, his back ramrod straight. The room fell silent, waiting. He placed his trembling fingers on the keys. They felt slick and foreign, too easy to press down. There was no fight, no resistance, no soul. He took a deep breath and began to play. The song that came out was a simple, hesitant melody. One of the first tunes he had ever taught himself on the beast, but on this perfect instrument, it sounded small and childish. His fingers, which were so used to the unique quirks of his old piano, felt clumsy and out of place. He fumbled a note, then another. The simple melody fell apart in his hands. For a moment there was a stunned silence. And then it started. A low chuckle from Julian, which quickly spread to his friends and then to the whole room. Soon, the ballroom was filled with the sound of laughter. It wasn't just a few people. It was a wave of noise that crashed over him, washing away every bit of his confidence. The laughter was cruel and sharp, and it echoed in his ears. He saw Julian's face, contorted with a look of triumphant amusement. Leo's face burned with shame. He snatched his hands away from the keys as if they were on fire and stood up. Without a word, he turned and fled, pushing past the laughing guests, his vision blurred with tears. He didn't stop until he was back in the relative safety of the kitchen, where the other servers wouldn't meet his eyes. He had wanted to show them his passion, his music. Instead, he had become their joke for the night. The laughter of the rich followed him all the way home, a sound that would haunt him for a long, long time. The laughter didn't stop when he left the mansion. It followed him home on the bus, echoing in the empty seats and the rattling windows. It was there in the silence of his apartment, ghostly sound that seemed to bounce off the peeling wallpaper and the stacks of old boxes. For days, Leo couldn't bring himself to even look at the beast. The piano, which had been his sanctuary, his voice, now felt like the source of his shame. It was a reminder of the night his passion had been turned into a circus act, a moment of pure public humiliation. He would come home from his shift at the warehouse, his body aching and his mind numb, and just sit in the dark. The memory of Julian's smug face and the cruel, echoing laughter playing on a loop in his head. He tried to push it away. He tried to lose himself in the mindless routine of his job, focusing on the weight of the boxes and the rhythm of the conveyor belt. But it was no use. During his lunch break, he would find himself unconsciously tapping his fingers on the table. But the sound would make him flinch, reminding him of the clumsy, pathetic melody he had played. At night, he would lie in bed, the city's usual symphony of sirens and distant music, sounding like a mocking chorus. The world felt louder, more aggressive, as if it were laughing at him too. He felt small and invisible in a way he never had before. Not just a poor kid from a bad neighborhood, but a joke. A week passed, then two. The apartment grew dusty and quiet. The beast sat in the corner, a silent, hulking shape covered in a thin layer of grime, its keys looking sad and neglected. Leo felt a pang of guilt every time he walked past it. He had abandoned his only friend. One evening after another long, soul-crushing day, he found himself standing in front of the piano. He slowly reached out and traced the long, jagged scratch on its side, a scar they now shared. He remembered the day he found it, the joy he felt bringing it home, the hours he spent lovingly restoring it. This piano wasn't the source of his shame. It was the victim of it, just like him. something inside him began to shift. The heavy, suffocating blanket of shame started to feel lighter, and underneath it, a new emotion was glowing. It was hot and sharp and dangerous. It was anger. A slow-burning anger at Julian for his cruelty, at the guests for their thoughtless laughter, and at himself for letting them get to him. The anger was a spark, but it was enough to ignite the dry tinder of his despair. He would not be a joke. He would not be a memory they laughed about over their expensive brunches. He would not let them take the one thing that was truly his. He sat down on the worn wooden bench. The familiar feel of the keys under his fingers was a comfort, but it was different now. There was a new tension in his hands, a new energy coiled in his shoulders. He took a deep breath and began to play. The music that came out was not the sad, gentle melody of his old life. It was a storm. It was a torrent of anger and pain, hammered out on the keys with a force that made the beast groan in protest. The notes were sharp and discordant, a chaotic clash of sound that mirrored the chaos in his soul. He wasn't trying to make beautiful music anymore. He was trying to start a fight. He was pouring all of his humiliation, all of his rage into the piano, and the piano was taking it. Its old wooden frame vibrating with the force of his fury. This raw, explosive energy became his new routine. Every night after his shift, he would come home and unleash his anger on the beast, but he soon realized that anger alone wasn't enough. It was a wild, untamed fire, and it was burning him up. He needed to control it, to shape it, to turn it into something more powerful than just noise. He remembered the perfect, gleaming Steinway at the mansion, and the technical perfection that Julian's world respected. He realized that to truly win, he couldn't just play with passion. He had to play with a skill that was undeniable, a precision that was flawless. He started spending his meager earnings not on food or new clothes, but on second-hand sheet music. He would hunt through dusty shops in forgotten parts of the city, looking for the most difficult, most virtuosic pieces he could find. He bought books by composers he had only heard of, names like Liszt and Rachmaninoff, whose music was known for its lightning-fast runs and thundering chords. He didn't have a teacher, so he became his own. He would spend hours on a single page, a single measure, playing it over and over again until his fingers ached and his mind was numb. He would slow the difficult passages down, playing them note by note, his left hand and right hand learning their parts. Separately before he tried to put them together, his small apartment became a forge, and he was the blacksmith, tempering himself in the fires of his own determination. The beast was his anvil. The city outside, with its noise and its energy, was the bellows fanning the flames of his ambition. He practiced until his fingers bled, until the calluses on his fingertips were thick and hard as stone. He lost weight, his face becoming leaner, his eyes more focused and intense. His co-workers at the warehouse noticed the change. He was even quieter than before. But it wasn't the silence of sadness. It was the silence of deep concentration. He would tap out complex rhythms on his legs during his breaks, his mind a million miles away, lost in a world of arpeggios and crescendos. He was no longer just playing music. He was building a weapon. Each difficult passage he mastered was a new, sharpened blade. Each flawless scale was a polished shield. He was transforming his raw emotion into technical perfection, forging his humiliation into a tool of power. The music he played began to change again. It was still full of fire and passion, but now it was controlled, precise. The anger was still there, but it was no longer a wild, raging fire. It was a focused, white-hot flame, capable of cutting through steel. He could play the fastest, most complicated passages with a breathtaking accuracy, but he never lost the soul, the raw, human emotion that had always been at the heart of his music. One night, almost a year after the gala, he was practicing a particularly difficult piece by Liszt. It was a whirlwind of flying notes, a piece that seemed impossible for a human with only 10 fingers to play. He had been working on it for months, and tonight something clicked. His fingers, now strong and independent, flew across the keys with a speed and grace he had never imagined possible. The music that filled the small apartment was not just noise or even just a song. It was a story. It was the story of his humiliation, his anger, and his triumphant rise from the ashes. The final notes hung in the air, clear and ringing with a power that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Leo sat back, his chest heaving, a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead. He looked at his reflection in the dark wood of the piano and saw a stranger staring back. It was a young man with hard eyes and a set jaw, a man who was no longer afraid of anyone's laughter. The fire had been forged, and it was ready to be unleashed. A year can feel like a lifetime when you spend it in a forge. For Leo, the past 12 months had been a blur of sore fingers, sleepless nights, and a burning, all-consuming focus. The quiet, unsure boy who had fled the Sterling mansion in shame was gone, replaced by a young man with a lean, determined look in his eyes and a quiet confidence in the way he carried himself. The warehouse was still a part of his life, but it was no longer his reality. It was just the place he went to earn the money for his sheet music and to keep the lights on so he could practice. His real world was the one he created on the worn keys of the beast. Now, he was standing in the wings of the city's grandest concert hall. The same hall where the Sterling Foundation held its most prestigious events. The air was thick with the smell of old wood, velvet, and the faint, clean scent of floor polish. This was the final round of the city's most prestigious young artists competition, and he had made it. He had bulldozed through the preliminary rounds with a ferocity that had surprised the judges and silenced the other. More formally trained contestants, they had all the right schools and the famous teachers. But he had something they didn't, a fire that had been forged in humiliation. His heart was a steady, heavy drum against his ribs, but it wasn't the nervous flutter of a year ago. This was a different feeling, a calm, focused energy. He peered through the small gap in the heavy velvet curtain at the audience. It was a sea of formal wear and expectant faces. And then his eyes landed on the front row. He felt a jolt, like an electric shock, as he saw him. It was Julian Sterling, looking bored and elegant in a tailored suit, holding a judge's clipboard. He was a guest judge, representing his family's philanthropic arm. A cruel twist of fate, or perhaps a perfect one. For a moment, the memory of the laughter tried to creep back into his mind, the sound sharp and painful. But this time, it didn't make him feel small. It fueled the fire. This wasn't just a performance anymore. It was a conversation, and the piano was going to do the talking. A stagehand gave him the nod. Leo walked out onto the stage, the bright lights warming his face. The hall was hushed. The only sound, the soft squeak of his dress shoes on the polished wood. He didn't look at Julian. He didn't look at anyone. He just walked to the center of the stage, to the gleaming black concert grand piano that sat there like a sleeping beast. This one was perfect, a far cry from his own beast, but he was no longer intimidated by its perfection. He knew that a piano was just wood and wire. The soul came from the person who played it. He sat down on the bench, adjusting it with a small, precise movement. He placed his fingers on the keys, feeling their cool, smooth surface. For a moment, he just sat there, letting the silence of the hall settle around him. He could feel the weight of 1,000 expectations, but he also felt the memory of 1,000 hours of practice. He had chosen his final piece carefully. Liszt's La Campanella, meaning the little bell. It was a piece famous for its sparkling difficulty, for its dizzying, lightning-fast passages, and a delicate, ringing high note that repeats throughout the piece like a tiny, clear bell cutting through a storm. He took a breath, and then he began to play. The first notes that erupted from the piano were not just loud. They were startling. They were a storm of sound, a dizzying rush of notes that seemed impossibly fast and complex. The audience members who were familiar with the piece leaned forward in their seats, their eyes wide. This wasn't just technically proficient. It was possessed. Leo's fingers were a blur, flying across the keys with a speed and power that seemed to defy human capability. But it wasn't just noise. Within the chaos, there was a story being told. The music began to whisper. In a softer, more melancholic passage, could almost hear the rumble of a subway train, and the lonely sound of a siren in the distance. It was the sound of a small apartment, of a life lived in the shadows of a great city. Then the music began to roar. The thunderous chords and aggressive crashing runs were the sound of pure, unadulterated anger. It was the sound of cruel laughter, of public shame, of a spirit being crushed. You could feel the frustration and the pain in every heavy, deliberate note. The audience was no longer just listening to a performance. They were feeling an experience. They were living his story with him. Then, through the storm, came the bell. The first high, piercing note rang out, clear and pure as a drop of water. It was a moment of hope, a single, defiant sound in the midst of chaos. And as the piece continued, the bell kept returning, each time stronger, more insistent. The music began to change again. The anger was still there, but now it was tempered with something else. It was the sound of determination, of a long, lonely fight in a small, dusty room. The fast passages were no longer just chaotic. They were focused, like a blacksmith hammering hot steel, shaping pain into strength and humiliation into purpose. Julian Sterling sat frozen in his chair. The bored smirk had long since vanished from his face, replaced by a look of utter disbelief. He wasn't just hearing a difficult piano piece. He was hearing his own cruelty thrown back at him, transformed into something so powerful and so beautiful that it took his breath away. He remembered the clumsy, hesitant melody from a year ago, the sound he had laughed at. This was the same person, the same hands, but the music was a universe away. He saw the faces in the crowd around him, their eyes closed, their bodies swaying slightly, completely lost in the sound. He saw the other judges, their pens forgotten, their expressions a mixture of awe and shock. He had tried to make Leo a joke, but Leo had turned that joke into a masterpiece. The music soared towards its climax. The little bell theme was no longer just a single note. It was a cascade of sparkling, crystal-clear sound, ringing out with a triumphant joy that seemed to lift the very roof off the concert hall. It was the sound of a spirit that could not be broken, a voice that had found its power. Leo's hands moved with an effortless grace, his body swaying with the music, completely lost in the world he was creating. He was no longer just playing the piano. He and the piano had become one single entity, a vessel for a story that needed to be told. The final. Thundering chords crashed through the hall, and then there was silence. Not the polite, waiting silence of a concert, but a deep, profound, stunned silence. It was as if everyone in the room had stopped breathing at the same time. The last note seemed to hang in the air, shimmering with an impossible energy. For a full 10 seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath, processing the raw, emotional journey they had just been taken on. Then, a single person in the back row started to clap. It was a slow, deliberate clap. Then another joined in, and another. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. The hall erupted. It wasn't just applause. It was a tidal wave of sound, a deafening roar of cheers and whistles that seemed to shake the foundations of the building. Every single person was on their feet, their faces filled with an emotion that went far beyond simple appreciation. It was awe. It was respect. It was a shared understanding that they had just witnessed something truly extraordinary. And in the front row, Julian Sterling slowly rose to his feet. His face pale, his hands clapping mechanically, his eyes fixed on the young man at the piano who had, without saying a single word, spoken the last, definitive word. The piano had sung its song, and the whole world was listening. The wall of sound that hit him was a physical force. It was a roar, a tidal wave of pure noise that seemed to lift him right off the bench. For a moment, Leo just sat there, his fingers still resting on the keys, his mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. He saw a blur of faces, all turned towards him, their mouths open, their hands clapping in a frantic, joyful rhythm. The lights of the concert hall, which had seemed so harsh and intimidating just minutes before, now felt warm, like an embrace. He slowly stood up, his legs feeling unsteady, and turned to face the audience. He saw the other judges on their feet, their faces filled with a respect that he had only ever dreamed of. and then he saw Julian. The young heir was still clapping, but his face was pale. His eyes wide with a look that was a mixture of shock and something else. Something that looked a lot like regret. Leo gave a small, awkward bow. He didn't know what else to do. He had poured his entire soul into the piano, and this was the echo that came back. The rest of the evening was a blur. The announcement of his name as the winner felt almost like an afterthought. The audience had already decided. He was handed a heavy crystal trophy and a certificate, but they felt like strange foreign objects in his hands. Backstage, it was chaos. People he didn't know were slapping him on the back, shaking his hand and congratulating him with tears in their eyes. Reporters shoved microphones in his face, asking him questions he couldn't quite process. How did you do it? What were you thinking? Who was your teacher? He mumbled some simple answers, his mind still ringing with the music and the applause. He felt like an astronaut who had just returned from a distant planet, and everyone wanted to know what it was like out there. But he didn't have the words to describe it. He found a quiet corner behind a thick velvet curtain and just stood there for a moment, trying to breathe, trying to ground himself in the reality of the moment. Soon, he was led out onto a small stage for a press conference. He sat at a long table with the other judges, the bright lights of the cameras flashing in his eyes. A reporter stood up and asked the judges for their final thoughts on the competition. One by one, they praised the technical skill and emotional depth of all the contestants. But their eyes kept flicking over to Leo. Then, it was Julian's turn. He leaned into his microphone, and the room fell silent. He looked different. The arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by a quiet, somber expression. He didn't look at the other judges or the reporters. He looked directly at Leo. "I don't really have any thoughts on the competition," Julian began, his voice a little shaky. "I just have something I need to say." He took a deep breath. "About a year ago, at a party at my parents' house, I did something. I did something that was ignorant and cruel. I publicly humiliated this young man for no other reason than my own boredom and arrogance." A murmur went through the room of reporters. "I laughed at him. We all did. And I thought it was funny." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Tonight I didn't just hear a brilliant piano performance. I heard the truth. I heard a story that I was a part of, a story of pain and anger and incredible strength. And I realized that I wasn't just laughing at a person who couldn't play a perfect melody. I was laughing at something I couldn't possibly understand. I was laughing at a passion that was more real and more powerful than anything I have ever known." He looked down at his hands for a moment, then back up at Leo. "So I just want to say, in front of everyone, that I am truly and deeply sorry. What you did tonight wasn't just music. It was a lesson, and I am the one who needed to learn it." The room was completely silent. Leo just looked at him, his face unreadable. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't need to say anything. The music had already said it all. Later that night, Leo found himself on the bus, heading back to his neighborhood. The heavy crystal trophy was tucked carefully into a bag on his lap. He could have taken a car, but he didn't want to. He needed the slow, rhythmic journey, the familiar sights and sounds of the city at night. As the bus rumbled through the streets, he looked out the window at the passing world. The corner stores, the neon signs of the laundromats, the people waiting at the bus stops, it all looked the same, but it felt different. It no longer felt like a cage. It felt like home. The sounds of the city were no longer a mocking chorus. They were the rhythm of his life, the very source of his music. He had traveled to their world, played their game on their stage, and he had won. But he realized he didn't want their world. He just wanted them to respect his, when he finally unlocked the door to his small apartment. The familiar smell of dust and old wood welcomed him like an old friend. The place was exactly as he had left it that morning, cramped, a little messy, and quiet. But it didn't feel small anymore. It felt like a sanctuary. He placed the trophy and the winner's certificate on his small kitchen table. They looked out of place there, like artifacts from another world. He walked past them and went straight to the corner of the room, to the large, hulking shape that stood there in the dim light. He ran his hand gently over the top of the beast, his fingers tracing the familiar scratches and dents. This was his real trophy. This was his prize. He sat down on the worn wooden bench, the one that was molded perfectly to the shape of his body. He didn't play Liszt or Rachmaninoff. He didn't play the music of anger and revenge. He placed his hands on the familiar, slightly yellowed keys and began to play one of the first simple melodies he had ever taught himself. It was the same sad, lonely tune he had played a lifetime ago, but now it sounded different. It wasn't sad anymore. It was peaceful. It was the sound of a long journey finally coming to an end. It was the sound of coming home. The music filled the small apartment, not with a storm, but with a quiet, gentle light. He hadn't sought their approval or their world. He had only needed to prove to himself that his music was real, that his passion was worth something. And in the end, as the final notes hung in the air of his own small world, he knew that the piano and the unbreakable spirit it held had the last definitive word.